So here's where we start. What does an ecosystem have to do with an economy? There's a pair of straightforward answers. They may even have occurred to you. For one thing, the economy gets some important inputs from ecosystems. Trees, fish, clean water, just to name a few. Going the other direction, when the economy harvests trees or pollutes or lays down pavement, that affects ecosystems. These answers aren't wrong, but there's another one that goes a bit deeper. That's the idea that an economy is itself kind of like an ecosystem, or that economies and ecosystems are two instances of the same thing. This course uses ecosystems as a model to understand how an economy works. The rest of this chapter gives an overview of the role of resources in the economy and the connections between economies and ecosystems. The rest of Part 1 covers how ecosystems work, then explains how an economy is an extension of an ecosystem, and wraps up with examinations of money, banking, and government. Part 2 introduces some of the standard terminology of macroeconomics and connects it to the ecosystem-based approach of Part 1. Part 3 is about how an economy grows over the long term. Part 4 explains the business cycle. But that's all off in the future. For now, we have to step back, start from the conventional perspective, and begin to see how resources and ecosystems should be tied in. Normally, we treat economics as a strictly social science. We study how people make all sorts of decisions, things like what to buy, what work to do, and how much work to do. And they do this in some sort of society. So, economics is a social science. Within that social framework, people face costs and benefits. They try to minimize their costs and maximize their benefits. Given that general framework, the field is divided into two basic parts. In microeconomics, we consider decisions made in isolation. We take the economy as a whole as given. Macroeconomics is different. It concerns the economy as a whole, the totality that results from those individual decisions. We look at things like the overall level of output, the overall level of employment and of wages, interest rates in different markets, aggregate quantities of consumption, government spending, investment, exports, imports. Whether it's micro or macro, the focus is on the social determinants, the choices that humans make, and why they make them. But the thing is, social decisions have physical consequences, and they're influenced by physical constraints. It's not a coincidence that this GM factory in Germany is built right next to a railroad line. If you're making cars, you need to bring in lots of physical inputs, and you need to ship out your finished automobiles. Trains are a really good way to do both those things. When another company decided to make cement, that wasn't just an abstraction. This actual cement factory came into being where none had stood before, and when the cement business went under, that wasn't just a business decision on paper. It meant that this massive facility would become a decrepit shell. And when someone else decided that it could be converted into residential and exhibition space, that also had physical effects. In this Nokia factory, materials and energy are needed to make the machines and build the factory. Additional materials and energy are needed to operate the machines and make the phones. At the Ben & Jerry's ice cream factory in Vermont, just like at Nokia, materials and energy went into making the machines. They need milk, sugar, chocolate, and other ingredients to make the ice cream. And just as at Nokia, they need energy to operate the factory itself. So even at the microeconomic level, almost every decision is affected by resource availability, or has an effect on resources, or some combination of the two. Still, in micro, we can get away with leaving the physical dimension aside, or taking resource availability as given. Sure, if resource availability changes, that will have effects on the situation we're analyzing, but it's only one kind of effect, and it's not always relevant. Macro is different. In macro, physical effects become crucial. At the aggregate level, changes in GDP, employment, investment have physical consequences and physical requirements. If we increase GDP, we tend to increase pollution. If we invest in resource extraction, we tend to affect the economy as a whole by making more resources available. Different directions for society are easier, harder, or simply impossible under a particular set of resource conditions. Reviewing, the functioning of the economy as a whole depends on the availability of natural resources. It also changes the availability of natural resources. It involves the use of energy, derived from the environment in various ways, to transform other natural resources. Looking at some examples, we can see that change in the economy is some combination of change in how the economy uses resources and change in the availability of resources. With land transportation, where we have animals pulling our wagons, we're looking at grass as our source of energy. By the mid-18th century, when you have steam engines, you've moved to coal or sometimes wood. And by the mid-20th century, you're looking at more sophisticated forms of coal. And in modern times, you switch to much more sophisticated forms of electricity, some of which is derived from coal. On the sea, there was a big step forward when people figured out how to use the wind. By the 19th century, we had more sophisticated ways of using the wind. And then we moved to bigger ships burning coal. And then we moved to oil and really, really big ships. Back on land, we had grass. And then simple gas engines, moving on to modern sophisticated gas engines. Even the surfaces we travel on have changed, starting with the simple dirt lane, and then moving to macadam, which made it easier to travel, particularly in wet weather, and on to the engineering marvel of the modern freeway interchange. Maybe that's where we're headed. Note that that's not a real picture. In the air, we started with simple gas engines and an open airplane. By mid-century, people were traveling in relative comfort with 4 propeller engines, and now we have modern jumbo jets with 4 or 6 jet engines. So economic change involves changes in how we use resources, or new ways of using resources, or changed availability of resources. That all fits under those straightforward answers about the economy-ecology connection, how resources affect the economy, and how economic processes affect resources. But there's also that deeper connection, the idea that the macroeconomy itself is like an ecosystem. But it's not just that they're like each other, rather, both are examples of the same kind of thing, a complex adaptive system, something we'll look at in more depth in Chapter 3. In an ecosystem, we study the behavior and evolution of individual organisms or individual species. That's like microeconomics. We also study the functioning of the whole system. That's like macroeconomics. When economics is properly understood, there's a structural similarity between it and ecology. In ecology, we see how species behavior and genetics interact with the physical reality to structure the ecosystem. In economics, we see that social behaviors, the usual economic concern, interact with the physical reality, like geology, climate, the biology of other species, to structure the economy. So we'll treat the macroeconomy just as we would an ecosystem. We'll treat it as a CAS, a complex adaptive system. It's true that the economy is a social entity, but it's also a biophysical system, something that exists in the physical world, subject to physical laws. The rest of this first part of the course will build up that in more detail. Before we go, it's worth pausing for an etymological footnote. You probably noticed that both ecology and economics share their first 3 letters. They come from the Greek word oikos, which means something like household, house, family. Then there's logos, which has to do with order, knowledge, we might say understanding. So we have ecology, an understanding of the household, knowledge about the household. Next up, there's nomos, meaning law, derived from a word for dispensing or allotting, hence related to managing, which gives us economics, the management of the household. It strikes me that the management of the household should be based on a good understanding of how the household works. In other words, economics should be based on ecology. So that's the goal for this course.